Hello everybody and welcome to the second video of my breakdown of the iGCSE biology course. This video is going to cover these specification points on cell structure. As always, this video is tailored for the digestible iGCSE course and preparing you for its exam. However, if you're studying under another exam board like AQA or Cambridge, you'll probably still find this video useful. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Now, in the last video, we learned to determine if something is a living organism or not through checking if it carried out the Mrs. H-Gren processes. Now that we know what living organisms are, let's dig a little deeper. Every living organism is made up of these tiny things called cells. They're the smallest units of organization, the building blocks that make up an organism's body. Some organisms' whole bodies can just be one single cell, and others, like us humans, can have bodies made up of around 30 trillion cells. We'll be looking at two specific types of cells today, animal and plant cells. So let's take a look at this diagram of an animal cell right here. Immediately, you're going to notice all of these different structures within the cell itself, and we call these organelles. They're basically the parts or organs of a cell, and they carry out specific functions within it. Let's zoom in a little bit on each one of these organelles. First, we've got the nucleus. It's an organelle which contains the genetic material of the cell that controls its activities, and it's surrounded by its own membrane. Think of it like this, a massive bundle of all the cell's genetic information sealed in this little sort of capsule by an outer membrane. You usually always spot this one when you draw or label a cell because it's the biggest organelle in the cell. Next up is the cell membrane. It's the barrier around the outer surface of the cell, and its function is controlling what substances go in and out of the cell. After that, we have the cytoplasm. It's this jelly-like substance where most of the cell's chemical reactions happen, and it contains these things called enzymes which control these reactions. But you'll learn more about those in a later video. For now, the cytoplasm is just where most of the chemical reactions happen in the cell. And then we've got the mitochondria, or in this case, a mitochondrion, because it's singular. You might have heard of these somewhere as the powerhouses of the cell, but forget that definition, because it's not really true, and unfortunately your exam board doesn't accept it for an answer. Anyways, mitochondria are small organelles where most of the reactions for aerobic respiration will take place. And this aerobic respiration transfers the energy that the cells need to work. Here's a quick look at what aerobic respiration looks like in an animal cell. As you can see, the result is the release of energy, which is why you find a lot more of these mitochondria in something like muscle cells, which need a lot of energy to let you contract and relax your muscles and move them around. So, to sum it up, mitochondria are the site of aerobic respiration in the cell. Finally, we've got ribosomes. I've highlighted a ribosome here with a red color just to make it clearer, but all of those black dots around the cell are ribosomes too. They're probably the easiest organelles you'd be asked to draw when drawing cells, just a nice little dot. Anyways, ribosomes are small organelles where proteins are made in the cell. In other words, they are the sites of protein synthesis. And that's everything for animal cells. But it's worth mentioning that not all animal cells will obviously look like this, and they don't have a fixed shape like the one you see. This is just one of many types of cell, a human cheek cell to be exact. But they've chosen it as the model to teach you as it contains all the organelles you've got to know about. So, whenever you're asked to draw or label an animal cell, make sure you've got this model learned perfectly and know all of the organelles' functions. Moving on now to plant cells. So, plant cells usually have all the same organelles that animal cells do, the ones we just learned about, except that plant cells have a few extra ones too. Take a look at this plant cell here, and you'll notice that plant cells, unlike animal cells, have a more regular structure. And again, there are some additional organelles you won't recognize. Let's go through these organelles now. First of all, we have the chloroplasts, these little green balls here. Now, these are actually the reason that plants have that green color, because they contain a substance that's a green pigment, and that pigment is called chlorophyll. The function of these chloroplasts is undergoing the process of photosynthesis, which makes food for the plant. How does it do that? Well, another thing that the chlorophyll does, other than giving that green color, is that it traps sunlight. And if you look at this equation for photosynthesis, you notice that the chlorophyll inside of these chloroplasts needed to trap this sunlight so that photosynthesis can occur. Which is why those two things are above and below the arrow, because you need light and you need that chlorophyll for a reaction to happen, because that chlorophyll is the one trapping the light. And as a result, plants can produce their food in the form of the sugar glucose. As you might have already noticed, the photosynthesis equation is basically just the aerobic respiration flipped, if you're flipping the reactants or the products. So, to sum it up, chloroplasts are the sites where photosynthesis takes place, and they contain chlorophyll, which traps sunlight they need for it to happen, and is also a green pigment. Next, we have the cell wall. It's a very rigid structure and a wall outside of the cell membrane. Make sure you don't mix those two up when you're labeling. It's the cell wall that's on the outside and the cell membrane inside. And that cell membrane is around the cytoplasm like we saw in the animal cell. Anyways, this strong cell wall is made up of a molecule named cellulose, which gives the wall this high tensile strength. And as a result, its function is to support the cell and strengthen it. This is the reason plant cells have such a regular shape like we mentioned earlier. It's this cell wall giving them the structure, support, and a defined shape. Please note, however, that it's a very common mistake you'll see students make when they say that the cell wall offers protection. No, it does not. It gives the cell structure, support, and defines its shape. It's very important that you avoid making this mistake, as according to examiner reports, it's quite common, and you don't want to lose marks on something like this. Finally, we've got the vacuole, often called the permanent vacuole. If you're interested in why, it's because animal cells can sometimes develop vacuoles too, but those are temporary vacuoles made for a specific purpose, while these plant cell vacuoles are permanent. This vacuole is essentially a large storage space for something we call cell sap, which is this liquid that's a solution of sugars and salts the cell needs inside it. Another function it has is supporting the shape of the cell. Before we finish off, it's worth quickly mentioning that, of course, just like the cheek cell we saw earlier, it's important that you realize that not all plant cells will look like this. But again, you need to learn this model of a palisade cell in a leaf because it has all the organelles you need to know about. It's also the reason why you see so many chloroplasts in this specific plant cell, as palisade cells are in the leaves of plants, which are where most photosynthesis is happening because they're directly exposed to light. So having a lot of chloroplasts in this area maximizes the absorption of this light and maximizes photosynthesis for more energy. So, for a brief review, this table summarizes all the different organelles we've studied today in both plant and animal cells, and all those key definitions you'll need to know for your exam. Pause the video now and make sure you're comfortable with these definitions before moving on. Now it's time to consolidate with some questions testing your understanding of the content and prepare you for the exam technique by trying a few past paper questions. Have a go at this first question. In which of these cell structures does aerobic respiration occur? A mitochondrion, B, the nucleus, C, a ribosome, or D, the vacuole? Now, the correct answer here is A, the mitochondrion, as mitochondria are the sites of aerobic respiration in a cell. Now go ahead and try this question. Which organelle makes glucose? Is it the cell membrane, a chloroplast, the nucleus, or a vacuole? The correct answer is B, chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are where photosynthesis happens. And if you remember from the equation earlier, one of the products of photosynthesis is glucose, and that's where the glucose is made in the cell. Next, give this question a go. The correct answer here is C, because the cell wall is on the outside of the cell, and you can find chloroplasts in the cytoplasm. Now, this time we've got a drawing question. Give it a go. So your diagram should look something like this, with a similar shape for the animal cell, and at least 4 of these features drawn and labeled correctly. Make sure you've drawn them and labeled them correctly so you can score those 4 points. One more question before moving on now. Try this. The diagram shows the structure of a palisade cell from a leaf. Which structure labeled contains chlorophyll? Now looking at the diagram, decide if it's A, B, C, or D. And the answer here is C, because C is a chloroplast, and chloroplasts contain chlorophyll. Now we're going to move on to some past paper questions. These are questions I've taken from real papers, and they're the kinds of questions you're likely to be asked about this topic in your exam. Have a go at this first question. Here is my answer to it. I've talked about how plant cells have a cellulose cell wall and chloroplasts, while animal cells do not. And here's the mark scheme for this question so you can correct your answers. Next up is this question. Again, pause the video and give it a try. Here was my answer to it, and here's the mark scheme. These are the additional 3 organelles you find in a plant cell which you can't find in an animal cell. Make sure you've got all 3 correct so you can get those 3 marks. And now try this question too. A nice labeling question. Here was my answer, and here is the mark scheme. Make sure you label them correctly and correct your mistakes if you haven't. It's important for you to realize that some of these questions are going to come up where you're not necessarily getting the diagram that you know, the 2D diagram that you're prepared to draw, but you're going to get a 3D diagram or maybe a microscope image. so it's good to know the general idea of what they look like from these diagrams, but be prepared for any application questions like these ones in a real exam. And next we've got this question, a continuation from the last using the same diagram. Give it a shot. Here is my answer and here is the mark scheme. Both C and A work here because C is the cell wall and A is the permanent vacuole. But please note that if you were to write the actual names of the organelles instead of the letter here, like cell wall or permanent vacuole, even though you're right, you'd unfortunately not get the mark, as the question specifically asks for the letter and the mark scheme only accepts letters, as you can see. So just be careful of that and make sure you read the question properly. And finally, give these questions a try. Here's my answer. So here I talk about the function of chloroplasts, the chlorophyll inside them, and the role it plays in photosynthesis. I then go on to explain why palisade cells have a lot of chloroplasts because of direct exposure to sunlight, and a root cell will have none because they're underground and see no light anyway. So there's no real point in having chloroplasts inside of them because they won't be photosynthesizing. And then, for part C, we know that ribosomes are the sites of protein synthesis. And here is the mark scheme for this question. Now, obviously, the first part of the question is 3 marks. So if you've written any of those 3 points, you would score the 3 marks, which is what I've done in my answer, which ticks off 4 of the 5 possible points. The mark scheme also mentions guard cells and the spongy mesophyll, but I've chosen not to mention those for now, as we discuss them in a future video, and I don't want to confuse things. And with that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you found this video useful, drop a like, subscribe, and share to support the channel and help more students. For more lessons, check out my iGCSE Digestible Biology playlist, and feel free to comment down below or reach out via email if you have any questions or suggestions. That's all for this lesson. Have a nice day.